Welcome to episode number 11 of the OBRY Hours. I'm your host, John MacTemus. It's the 15th of August. Today it's early in the morning. Haven't been sleeping well lately, which is not something new. It's just been like that for, 7 to 10 years maybe. But I'll tell you, I don't know what's going on. I gotta talk about this a little before I get started with the material, just, for posterity, I guess. Living in West Central Michigan now. And the house that we live in, as compared to the house we lived in before, this house has, in at least the main and upper level, there's 3 levels, including a basement. The main and upper level is almost all double hung windows, and they're all relatively recently installed, and they all work well. Now, the old house was not like that. That we lived in. The old house actually, very few of the windows opened well. A lot of them were just aluminum framed sliding windows. Not very good. But this, they work well. Let's say that. So I try to pump in as much fresh air as possible every day. Fresh air and sunshine. And I don't know what it is. The air here, I think the air and the water here, they're so different. People would probably think, living where I did in Northwest Indiana, which was right on the along the edge of Lake Michigan, that there would be more pollution, more pollution because of all the industry. Maybe in the water, in the air, and everything. It's so different here, though. The water seems different. And the air seems different. It's just affecting my skin and everything else. And the thing about the air is, I wake up a lot of nights and the air, it stinks. Not stinks like a sewage stink. It stinks like in a foul way. Like some idiot is burning pressure treated lumber. That sort of smell. There's no major industry near where I'm at. Really. So I have no idea. I have no idea what's going on. And we had an electric storm, and I've been hearing other people in other parts of the country were saying they're having these severe electric storms. We had a couple this week. We had one that was so bad it knocked out our power. I guess it knocked out the power in a number of areas of Michigan. One of the lightning strikes, because it woke me up when it knocked the power out. I was up for a while. One of the lightning strikes happened as I was trying to get back to sleep on my couch, and I have a couple of open windows right near there, large windows. When I say open, there's no curtains or blinds or anything. And I had my eyes closed, and this occurred to the north of me. I would have liked to have seen that discharge because it was so bright. Now, lightning's bright. If your eyes are closed, you can, of course, tell it's flashing. Through your closed eyelids. This was different. This flash was so bright. It was like I was looking at a welding arc with my eyes closed. Very close up, and I've seen plenty of welding arcs that I've had to keep my eyes closed around. And the energy of it was phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. The thunder of it rolled around for such a long time. Just amazing. A number of our electronic devices haven't worked quite right. I haven't even checked my off-board hard drive to see how those things are. Just really weird. And I guess that the power companies up here, they're trying to deal with a number of outages in a number of places that have happened. And it just, my computer, for instance, is just not behaving right. It's just weird. So, all right, let's get to the material. This material that I'm going to go over in this episode, I could have kept working on this and developing this for a very long time. This, like the material in the last episode concerning Adam and Adame, it's again one of those subjects or terms that you can't just do simple word searches on, because unfortunately so many of the contexts that it's in demands that a number of the words that are in these verses be diligently traced down and translated according to their root families. And so doing that would take a very, very long time. Very, very long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover all the material that I have on it. There, of course, were a couple of other terms I wanted to go over too, which I don't think I'm going to be able to this time, that show up, of course, for the first time in Genesis chapter 1. They are terms that, similar to Adam, Adame, they are terms that are actually used redundantly. They appear with words in verses, in phrases, and contexts in a very redundant way. The same way that Adame will appear with Eretz, land, in a very redundant, seemingly not needful sort of way. Now, the word that we're going to look at is Strong's H929. BEME. BEME or BEME, I'm not exactly sure at this point in time. Spelled B-E-M-E, H929. BEME. Sometimes it'll appear as Be'emet, with that T cap at the end on the letter E. That happens also in Adamic quite a bit. It does happen in a lot of words that have that so-called E feminine end. Now exactly what that T does, I still don't exactly know. And of course, any reasons given via Masoretic interpretation are unacceptable. So this word, when it first appears, Genesis 1:24, it appears as cattle. Genesis 1:24, and it appears in 1:24, 1:25, and 1:26. I'll read those three verses in King James English. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Now, BEME is going to come in again in Genesis 2, Genesis 3, And then we'll see it again in Genesis 6, and so on. There's some strange things about this word. And that's what I'm going to discuss. Now, none of the concepts I talked about concerning Adame in the last episode, as much as many of them are very leading, and they are truly very leading, they're still not concepts yet that I thought, okay, this is something that I really want to set into stone, put into a paper, put into a presentation, and really solidify it. And this is the same thing with BEME. All I want to do is I want to discuss, that's part of the reason that this platform, the OBRY Hours, even exists. I want to discuss problems. One of the ways that we can do this, and this actually, it works very well. I don't know if I've talked about it in the past or not. Maybe. There's a really interesting thing that you can do. If you have a word, and I've talked at length in the past about the problems with all of these words, just their individual entries, having so many ways they're used. You can type in a number of words, I don't care what word, and you'll oftentimes see, you can use a lot of different programs to do this that has a Strong's or something. If you're dead set on using something other than Strong's, there's Cruden's and there's really not a lot of Bible sites out there that offer other concordances than Strong's. One of the things that you'll find out is that even though you can find other concordances, and I have a number of more obscure concordances, even ones that were produced apparently a few centuries ago, they all actually pretty much agree on a lot of the points that I tend to have to deal with as far as the inconsistency of words and definitions applied to these words. So by all means, go out and search for all the available concordances that you can possibly find. And what you will inevitably end up realizing is that it's almost like saying that you're very unhappy with the shape, the branch configuration of the maple tree in your backyard. You just don't like that at all. And so your answer is that you're going to tear that up, root and all, you're going to get rid of it. And in its place, you're going to plant a brand new maple tree. This is the problem with finding various concordances or various lexicons and various translations, all based on the same problematic texts. And not just texts, basically like the same few characters responsible for bringing us these texts. That's the problem. So look, by all means, go for it, knock yourself out. But in general, what we're looking at in the Strong's is pretty close to what you're going to see in a lot of other places. You might get some wide variation if you would use something like Jeff Benner's Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible. I think it's called the AHLB. Yeah, I'll tell you though, if you pay attention to the supposed logic of the way that he is interpreting these glyphs, you're going to find there's some serious problems there. You might want to give it wide berth. But anyways, take any word and just put it in the Strong's function of Blue Letter Bible or eSword or whatever is your preferred Bible hub. I don't care. And go to how many different ways that word appears. And almost all of them are going to tell you. It appears as this many times, and that this many times, and that this many times. And it can get pretty thick with the amount of different terms or words used for various occurrences of that one word that you're looking for the definition to. I want to know, what does this one word mean? Okay, so in the case of BEME, H929, it actually only has two. Lucky us. It appears as beast 136 times and cattle 53 times. A really interesting exercise that you can do to see maybe how accurate these words are that they've used to render this OBRY word is to go through the entries. They'll give you all of the entries. If you punch this into Blue Letter Bible below, you can scroll down, you look at all the entries, and now not every software agrees on how many entries of a certain word, and that's I guess a whole other topic, but in general you'll typically get pretty close to the mark, I suppose. So just scroll down and check out the entries and start scrolling through them, and there's something that I want you to try. And something that you'll have to keep in mind when you do this is that there are a number of words that do appear in the feminine form, and they're pretty inconsistent with how they present these. Some words they'll present as an entry. This entry may sometimes appear with the feminine E ending, and they'll include that in that entry. So sometimes, if you were trying to insert this male gender word in passages that would demand a female gender word, then that's not going to work. But you have to understand that typically, unless you find otherwise, which you might, so typically that's not going to be the case. But keep your eye out for that. Let's just take a word just out of the blue, because this will be a good illustration before we actually get to BEME. Strong's 5006. I typed it in at random, okay? It's got 25 occurrences. Sometimes you might actually have to write these down to test this, because there will be so many different ways that it occurs, different words it occurs as. 25 occurrences. 8 times as despised, 5 times as provoke, 4 times as abhor, 4 times as blaspheme, 2 times as contempt, and I think they misspelled contempt because it's contemn. Contemn. 1 time as flourish, and 1 time great occasion to blaspheme. Wow. Okay, so what you want to do is go down to the occurrences in the text. Find your first one, which is Numbers 14:11. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people," and there's the word, "provoke me?" And Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will this people provoke me?" So take that and try these other words that they use, in there. So read it again and insert these other words. How long will this people despise me? That works. How long will this people abhor me? Okay. How long will this people blaspheme me? Sure. How long will this people contempt me? Yeah, okay. How long will this people flourish me? Not so good. And then the last one, how long will this people great occasion to blaspheme me? Sure. So in that case, most of those ways that this word, it's nuts, nuts, Strong's H5006, most of the ways that it is rendered will work. That one won't. You might want to take a look at it. You can actually, in Blue Letter Bible, you can just click on flourish where it's listed at the top, and it will give you the verse that it's listed in. In this case, it's Ecclesiastes 12:5. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish. Now, we know that if it's that word being used, that flourish just doesn't work. And then it has to be probably something a lot more like those other ways that it's rendered, or something's very wrong. And you can make a note of that. That's something that you can do without knowing much, really, at all, about the language, to see how well a word might be rendered in all places. Let's say that you come to a verse, and you're trying to figure a verse out, and you've got a dozen, 2, 3 dozen words in just that verse, not to mention the passage, which gives you the context. You can just in English, just using the Strong's Concordance, you can go to each word's entry, and you can take a look at the various words used as translative words over that particular base word, which will help you a lot to actually see if all of those words are being used at least close to appropriately. Okay? Now we can do this also with BEME when we look in the verses where it's used. And we know that it's only translated 2 different ways. It's translated sometimes as cattle, sometimes as beasts. Now when we start in Genesis 1:24, it's cattle. They translate it as cattle. But if we read it again, and we insert the other word that it's translated as in other places, we can see whether that works well or not. Like Genesis 1:24, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, beasts and creeping things, and beasts of the earth. Well, that's kind of redundant. Okay, well, I guess I understand then why they used cattle there. That's interesting. So you can keep doing that. And one thing, of course, you will notice is that redundancy of beasts, because they have to change various terms at various places in order to keep up the charade, the improper translating of certain words. Now, the funny thing is this, and this is how I'm starting to, this is the theory that I'm forming about why so many terms are so poorly translated. and this is really working off what I think. Okay, if intelligent people had the opportunity to obscure what the Bible was saying in key sensitive passages, and they had the ability to say that the source language, OBRY, was something different, was used differently, that these terms were, and they could name the terms. Now, in a lot of passages, they really wouldn't have to do that. In a lot of passages that weren't all that sensitive, or that had material that they didn't particularly find that dangerous for certain people to know and understand, they really probably wouldn't pay much attention to those passages. Well, up until a point. What they would probably be doing, if they had opportunity and they had motive, they would be addressing the most sensitive passages, the ones that contain the greatest amount of damaging material for damaging to what it is they had hoped to accomplish. And there are things that they'd hoped to accomplish. They'd hoped to accomplish gaining power. They had hoped to accomplish getting into our countries and remaining there, because the countries of the Israelites, when we're being lawful and moral in the eyes of Yahweh, as he agreed with our forefathers, we are blessed above all the families of the earth. And they, like the parasites that they are, they wanted very much to be in close to that, because they knew that they could suck off so much of the excess of that, almost without being noticed. And they needed some sort of pretext to that. They very much needed to change our perception of history, our perception of who we are, our perception of who they are, our perception of races and the dynamics and place of races. They needed to change our perception of geography, the so-called Holy Land. Well, we'll say the Promised Land, and that's them that started calling it the Holy Land, you know. And sure, holies, that's fine, because if you figure holy, it's set apart, fine, that's fine. But they had to change a lot of these things. I think I named right there probably a lot of the things that they needed to change. There could have been more. And the thing is, it took them some time to develop this and to start implementing this. So they didn't really get it right the first time. But I think that is basically the modus operandi that we can look at when we look at terms that don't seem to logically follow any kind of consistency concerning root patterns, and the way that root patterns should stay pretty consistent as far as what they're talking about. If glyphs, if specifically this language is a language based on glyphs, glyphs are pictographs, like hieroglyphics. If you think of hieroglyphics, they're pictographs. Each one of them has an implied meaning. And each one in and of himself is almost carrying the potential of meaning in themselves, depending on what it is they're representing, that any English word, the entire word, might carry with it. And then when you start putting these things together, they start interacting, and more meaning can be derived, and so on. This is why, when you look at words, when you look at words and they are so similar, you'll notice that they have nearly the same glyphs to them. Or there are a lot of examples where there are words that they claim are just homonyms that contain exactly the same glyphs. And they have different Strong's entries. They call them, homonyms or antonyms, and say they have completely different meanings. And of course, who decides that? Well, the Masoretes. And who are the Masoretes? What is this system all about? Do they have any kind of proof of anything sort of supporting the veracity of that system, and so on and so forth? You can go take those thoughts all the way to their logical conclusion. Okay? So what we have here, we have a word that does share very similar glyphs with other concepts that we'll look at. And when we try to use the ways that it's translated, either cattle or beast, we do run into redundancy. Now, redundancy is a problem. When you run into redundancy, you have to look at why. This is what I just went on explaining the last few minutes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through a number of passages where this word BEME appears. Forgive me if I go back and forth between saying BEME and BEME, because I'm just not convinced yet which way it's supposed to be pronounced. So I apologize. That's the case with a lot of these words, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. So let's start out. We just saw it in Genesis 1. Essentially, it's just in a list of other creatures. It was in a list of kind of an overarching, maybe generalized list, perhaps, of creatures that were made to dwell on the land. And then it was included in a list of creatures, life forms, that Adam would have dominion over. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at it in these contexts, and we're just going to think if it makes the most sense just to consider it beast or cattle in these contexts. Or is it maybe something else? Now, something to keep in mind before we do it. You can look up just sort of the types of animals that there are, like scientific classifications for. And I'm not telling anybody to take the word of science. What we're trying to find out is what the Bible actually calls certain things, whether they be people things, people classifications, whether they be animal classifications, bird, fish. I don't care. Whatever and however the Bible is classifying things, we want to understand how the Bible is classifying things and why. one of the things that anybody who's probably listened to anyone in Christian identity or identity, is that they'll mix a lot of terms, and oftentimes when they are talking about other races, they will refer to them in terms like, for instance, beast. And now we know that, for instance, the Jews in their Talmud consider all non-Jews as cattle and sometimes beasts. It's not flattering. It's not flattering. And so I think that we really do want to know what's what and how to look at everyone, how to understand what we are and what the other creatures are in the world around us, and how to perceive them, how it is that the Bible tells us that we are to interact with everyone and everything around us. That's very important. So all these concepts, they have to be approached with I think a very high degree of just detached objectiveness. We can't get emotional right out of the bat and say things like, I remember some reactions I had years ago when I even started to broach these subjects. The first emotional programmed response that I had to certain concepts was, well, God's not racist. That's one of the first things anyone will probably hear when they start talking about maybe differences of race with other people. Clear, undeniable differences in race. They will tend to get that programmed response. God's not racist. Which, of course, does not reflect even somebody's understanding who knew nothing but English. If they paid close attention to the Bible, they would know that saying something like that is biblically incorrect. Okay? Because to be a racist is to be somebody who understands, first and foremost, the differences between races. Now, God, Yahweh, He does understand the differences between races and the differences between kinds and species and all those words that we use. But He understands the difference, and He wants to keep the difference between all kinds of things because He made everything perfect and good and as it ought to be. And who the hell are we to fool with the perfect way He made everything? What we need to do is understand the way He made everything and how everything was to interact. Then if we can understand the perversions of it and by whom and what that problem is and the problems that it's causing, perhaps then we can start working towards solutions. This is the importance of understanding what the Bible's really saying, how it's been changed, who has changed it, and what their agenda was. So now with the passages. Here we go, starting at Genesis 3:14. Yeah, so the first one, Genesis 3:14, this is actually, well, it's not the first. The first was in Genesis 1 we saw, but it's establishing a pattern. And it's worth looking at. This is where Nahash, this character, a talking snake. Of all things, talking snake. Anyways, this Nahash, he has deceived these two people. This woman, he deceived this woman. He didn't deceive the man. The man did what he did willingly, probably because the woman asked him to. That's why most men do things that don't make a lot of sense. So, this Nachash is being judged, and it's said that because you did this, you are cursed above all BEME, and Heat Eshadeh. Now, in the last episode, I went over Heat, H-Y-T, and the fact that it's actually, it falls within the listing of Hiya, or just He, H-Y. He, Hiya, it means, or it's used as, pretty successfully, something alive. Something that's living. You can very successfully put in that word in its various tenses whenever you see he and hiya very successfully. You could relatively successfully put it into all of the occurrences where it's heat. And remember, that's H-Y-T. Oftentimes, T it's used in lieu of that feminine E. That's true also. However, I did go over this last time, just going to repeat it briefly. Just because T is at the end of a word that sometimes does appear with that E ending, that does not mean that it is necessarily the same word. And it is quite possible, and again, I did go over this, that heat could in fact more likely be predatory animals. Animals, let's say, a little bit more wild. Okay? But what you are going to see is this pattern, this long-standing pattern of specifically when BEME and heat appear together in the same passage, that they're going to have to make BEME into cattle because they don't really have too many ways that they can translate heat other than beasts. So you've got this problem of redundancy. And you've got this problem of having to translate. This is the one of the main reasons why you're going to see BEME translated as cattle. Because it appears so often with this heat that they can successfully translate heat as beast. So they would have the embarrassment of redundancy in a lot of verses if they didn't change BEME. Okay? So after that, the next significant occurrence, and this is just really, these passages are such a can of worms. They require that basically Genesis 6 through Genesis 9. Yeah, Genesis 6 through 9. Everything, I think, really needs to be reworked. Rethought. Everything. From what we think we understand about a flood, the flood. I'm not saying there was no flood. I'm saying our understanding of everything about it maybe has to be reworked a little bit. Our understanding of the pretext before it happened and why it happened maybe needs to be reworked a little better, a little more consistently. And certainly what happened over the course of it, the creatures that came to Noah. Oh boy. But anyways, so there is one passage just as an illustration, okay? Genesis 6:7. Now, if BEME were appropriately translated as beasts, then here in Genesis 6:7, why is Ramash here? If BEME is beast, you understand beasts just means what? Anything on four legs, anything that's not a person's beast. And this is, again, another illustration. This is kind of like Genesis 3:14. I'm just showing you this is going to happen a lot. It's going to happen all the time. You're going to see Ramash with BEME. And there's a sort of a redundancy there too. And in 7:14, including 7:21, 7:23, 8:17, and 9:10, you're going to find it with he again, which is supposed to be that general overall beast, and then they have to swap it back to cattle. You see, there's real serious problems with this. No matter what else one may think about BEME or what BEME is, no matter what one may think of what Ramash is or Hia or Heat is, you have to recognize there is a problem of redundancy here that they have to deal with by changing the way that certain words are used. Now, another method that can help to get an idea of what passages that might have been the most sensitive passages that they wanted to change is if you find a greater concentration of, say, another way that a word is translated that don't really work very well. You can look for those patterns of concentration of that particular term, that particular rendering, where it doesn't work very well or it has to be changed in a consistent way in a certain area, and then it just goes back to the other way. Do you see what I'm showing you here? I hope. Because that's something that we're looking for. We're trying to look for the things that they changed, where these concentrations exist in having to change these words and terms as sort of red flags. And that's why I said somebody who really didn't know the source language, they could do this. They could look at these things by paying attention to patterns. Look at patterns. You could take a verse and you could know nothing but English, and take a verse, look at all the words in the verse, and if you use eSword, you can use the KJV plus, and it will give you the Strong's codes for all of those words. Sometimes you might want to cross-reference it with Hebrew Old Testament plus just to make sure, because sometimes in the English they don't include certain OBRY words. But you could just write all of those down, and you could go and you could check those by Strong's and see how many of them have consistencies and inconsistencies, and how many that they had to change in ways that are very particular to only that one verse or not. There's ways that you can look at this. Now, what happens is when they change these terms, because they really wanted to change it in a specific passage or concerning a specific concept that they really needed to change in order to suit their goals in the long run, maybe the short run too, what happens is that's part of the reason why you will get sometimes so many different ways that an entry is rendered, like so many different words that it's rendered as. That's one thing. The other thing is how you will get so many passages that are very odd. And you look at the passage and you think, I can't understand why in the world they would change that word there so it doesn't fit in with the passage. What's the point? That passage doesn't even seem like it's talking about something very sensitive. Well, first off, maybe it is. Maybe there are a lot of words that are changed in that passage. You're just not realizing it because you're looking at one word at a time, you know. The other thing is, a lot of it is likely just collateral damage. It's breakage, like the terms that they use, say, in retail. Breakage, okay? And what that is once they've accomplished what they want to in all of the more sensitive passages, that they really needed to change terminology, once they've done that, they have a certain amount of occurrences of maybe a certain word that they have to deal with after that. And I believe that that's oftentimes what gives rise to a word being rendered in so many different ways, and oftentimes being rendered very strangely in certain passages. Those head scratchers, like, that's weird. But these are all patterns, they're all clues, and they should all lead us to concepts, passages, things that they really did not want to remain clear, consistent, and understandable. Everything else besides that is, again, breakage. And I'm not saying that they wouldn't randomly go into a passage. Maybe they don't want to change the whole passage because the whole passage is not that sensitive, but there is a word in there that can't stay that way. They gotta change that word. And then sometimes you'll see those as there'll be entries in Strong's all by themselves. They'll only occur once or twice, and they'll be translated this way. And you look back, let's say you scroll one entry in Strong's back, one entry in Strong's forward, you say, oh, well, that looks like the exact same word. That's the same lettering. The only difference is the Masoretic dots and stuff, and that's one of the methods that they use to change words is they would put different dots and dashes and stuff on it sometimes. And then they would apply, of course, a different, phonetic rendering because that helped to substantiate the narrative that what they were doing in all of this was standardizing the pronunciation of the language. So they would also change. Those dots and dashes had phonetics attached to them. But when they would do that, that was a changing of words, so that words in certain passages would be changed to have different meanings than that word, that same exact word, would have in many other passages. I hope I'm adequately relaying the way these deceptive things are done. And why you can tell somebody, hey, look, the text is corrupted, man. No, it's not just my opinion. No, it's not just my opinion. Look at it. Now, I'm not saying the base text, we don't really know, because we can't properly examine the base text until we understand what the words mean. We have to understand what the words and language mean before we can properly examine the base text to see how they may have been changed. You get how that works? But you talk to somebody and you tell them, yeah, the text has been corrupted. And they go, no, that's it, you're talking crazy. But you explain to them, no, what's happened is, I'm not saying that they haven't been preserved. I'm not making any allusions like that. I'm trying to tell you that people have come and taken the text. People that they're called Masoretes. Did the Masoretes exist or not? I don't know. There's no proof these people existed, but something was done to the text by somebody at some point, so we might as well call them Masoretes. And they applied a system to the text that changed every friggin' thing about it. that does include the what we call Hebrew block text. That was applied to it too. And the way you do it is, when you've got these manuscripts, you round up a lot of... It's a process. It's a process. It's just like the process of changing history. It's like the process of changing a language. They did that in 1611 with the King James, and then before that with Shakespeare, and they successfully changed the language of English through these vehicles, and then destroying as much as possible that existed before that. It's a process. This is how it's done. And that's how they successfully did it with the so-called Hebrew portion of the Bible. It's not something fanciful to say that. And if you point out to somebody, well, look, you're still using this Hebrew terminology that is based on Masoretic Jewry. The Masoretes applying whatever they wanted as far as the meaning and the way that we understand the text to look and the way we understand the text to sound. And, for some people, that's just too much. It makes their brain swell and they can't cope with it. And one eye starts going in the wrong direction. But you don't have to freak out. Nobody has to freak out over this, okay? We do still have a lot of texts out there. And once we understand the way that the language was supposed to work, supposed to sound, how we were supposed to understand the terms, and so on and so forth, and get rid of the constant lies and liars, then we can start trying to understand. It's a process. It's a process. That's why I really don't like to argue too much with people about, the Bible, and because there's a process to it. I do argue a lot of times about things that seem like, they ought to be like common sense, or things that we should be able to maybe think through to their logical conclusions, or tracing to their logical sources, things like that. But when it comes to something like this, we have certain hurdles that have to be overcome before we can truly definitively say whatever, this, that, or the other. Okay, so after this, we're going to get into more just comparative verses. I'll name a number of verses where BEME actually appears with other supposed animals, and so that there's a problem of redundancy there. But let's go right into some passages that present our main big problems, because they're weird, is why. Okay, they're just weird. It's Exodus. We've got Exodus, basically about Exodus chapter 8 and 9, mostly in there, the plagues passages. So, like in Exodus 8:13, we'll take, for example, because that's a good one. Exodus 8:13. Oh, maybe I wrote down the wrong thing. Maybe it's supposed to be 8:17. I wrote down Exodus 8:13 and 14, and I'm not seeing it in English, because in English it's 8:17 and 18. See, this is one of the problems, I'm sorry, with when you use the Hebrew Old Testament Plus module in eSword, there can be verse offsets, because the Hebrew Old Testament Plus is using the Masoretico-critical version by Ginsburg, and it doesn't quite follow. And don't think all of a sudden, well, it would be better to use a Hebrew Masoretic version that is exactly the same as the King James, and that would be the Mikreot Gedolot, because it was also compiled and overseen by a Jew too. So, get over that. I would actually, if I had a module that was easier to read, that wasn't in the calligraphic block script that the HSB4 or N3 and 2, there's like 4 modules, 5 modules of the Hebrew Study Bible. I would probably use that more often. The reason I use the Hebrew Old Testament and Hebrew Old Testament Plus, which is based on the Masoretical Critical, it's easier to read. It's in more modern-looking Hebrew characters that are far easier to read than the calligraphic block script. Anyways, so instead, in the King James, it would be Exodus 8, 17, and 18. In the Masoretical Critical, it would be 13 and 14. So they go, and so they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Mitzrim. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not, so there were lice upon man, Adam, and upon beast, BEME. Okay? The first thing I would ask about this is a moral and ethical question. Now, we know that man can do things morally wrong, even if you don't believe the Bible. Even if you don't believe the Bible, you don't believe the laws of the Bible or anything that the Bible has to say about morality, you know for a fact that mankind, humans, people can do things morally wrong. You know that. And you know that because they can do things that are morally wrong, this is why we have courts and punishments and all that. Because they can do things that are morally wrong, they get punished. Now, here's the deal. We don't, and as far as I'm aware of, no culture has, and I'm talking about white cultures and non-white cultures alike, have any kind of criminal justice system for animals of any kind. Okay? If you get stung by a nest full of hornets, they do not send anyone out to round up those hornets, bring them in for questioning, take them before a magistrate, a judge, a tribunal, and try them for assault. If you get trampled by a horse, no one goes and arrests that horse, puts them in hoof cuffs, tries to find what witnesses there might be that might testify in a court of law against that horse for doing what it did. Why? Because in general, nearly every society out there, no matter how high-minded or low-minded they may be, in general, now there might be people in that society that have different opinions, and they might be considered as stupid. But most of those societies in general, the people, think, we can't really determine that this animal had, any kind of moral, ethical qualms, malicious intent. Do you understand where I'm going with that? Is that it's there's some moral implications here. This isn't the only plague of Mitzrim where the BEME, if they're supposed to be animals, are stricken with the same plague that Adam, which is translated as man, is stricken with. Now, those plagues are supposed to be stricken on the Mitzri people, in part because they were actively oppressing the Israelites, a people that Yahweh had entered into covenant with their forefathers, in part because their leader, who was their representative, Pharaoh, had done the same and was not being very cooperative. What we're looking at is a story that has moral and ethical implications. But for some reason, in the context of that story, the animals seem to be getting judged. Now, I'm not saying that animals can't suffer the consequences of man's behavior. They do. Everything in creation, that's maybe part of what we should get from the moral story of the fall in Genesis 3, is that everything is badly affected. So maybe that's what we're supposed to see. Maybe what we're supposed to see is that the beasts of Mitzrayim, they were getting judged because of what the people of Mitzrayim were doing. Maybe. But the thing is, it only says that, for instance, in these passages, that the lice were on Adam and BEME. Okay, well, one thing is, what's BEME supposed to be? Is it supposed to be cattle? Because the thing is, we're going to actually see a lot of verses that have, there's issues with that. We actually see a number of verses where BEME can't be cattle because they are portrayed as carnivorous. So, okay, are they just beasts? Are we looking at all beasts? Is it a generic overarching term? Were all the beasts of Mitzrayim struck? And what beasts are we talking about? Are we talking about ones that they had and kept as domestic beasts for companionship and pleasure, like parakeets and dogs and cats, as well as ones that they kept for sources of food, leather, warmth, wool? Which is it? Because we have the problem of, again, BEME appearing with terms such as Ramash, Hiya, Heat, which are variously translated in very interesting ways. Last episode I mentioned to you that after the flood, Noah is told to eat all Ramash. And the problem with the way that Ramesh is often translated, and they typically have to change it when we get to that verse, is because a lot of times people actually, they translate Ramesh as creeping things or lizards. And it's really kind of a foul thought that he would be told to eat everything that creeps. Are we talking like insects or reptiles? That's kind of disgusting. Yeah, I know I've talked to people who have eaten various reptiles. I actually tried gator once, too. I didn't like it. I've tried eel. I thought that was friggin' disgusting. Tasted like wet dirt. It tasted like the smell that you smell in the wet fields in a summer's evening. Not pleasant. So we have a real problem here with consistency and why these BEME, not Ramash, it's not saying all of the Hiya or Heat or anything of Mitzrayim were struck with these plagues, just BEME. And so I guess we're going to have to keep that in mind and see if this BEME can be, if we can adequately regard it as a generic term for beasts in general. Okay? All right. So now the thing is, if that were it, that would be enough to at least put us on high alert, set out some red flags. All right, well, we're going to have to watch this now because that's weird. But that's not it. The big problem comes in with... Oh, for one thing, yeah, then we have in Exodus 9:25. Just real quick. This was not the main point, but just real quick. The hail specifically coming down again on Adam and BEME. Specifically, it's BEME. We're not talking about Hit, Hiya. We're not talking about Makne, which we'll get to as well, or Ramesh. But the real kicker to this is going to be found when we go forward a little bit and we end up at Exodus 11. Now, this is considered the last plague of Mitzrayim. This is the Passover plague. This is the plague in which all of the children of Israel were to take this beast. It's described as it could be a young lamb or goat, and it has certain specifications that it has to meet, and each household would have to take of it when they slaughtered it. They would have to take of its blood. And they would have to apply that blood, a certain amount of that blood, just to the lintel and doorposts of their house. And if they did that, this messenger of death, this Malak Mut, would not affect those in that house. So what we've got is all Mitzrayim did not do this. And so in this night, everyone in Mitzrayim lost their firstborn. Everyone who had a firstborn son. Okay? Son. When you see Bekur, and that's the word that's used, it's our operative word in these passages, and we're going to see it as an operative word in passages after this. When we see Bekur, we're talking about the eldest son. We see this as relates to Jacob and Esau. We see this as relates to Pharez and Zerah, the sons of Judah. We see this a lot because it's actually quite important to be the firstborn, the eldest son. Because, for instance, in relation to the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it was quite important, which is why Jacob actually saw having that birthright as so important, and the fact that Esau didn't is what made him so profane and thus hated by Yahweh, because he regarded the importance of that covenant and being the firstborn as something meh. In a sense, yes, that was his attitude. Meh. I like other stuff more. And he did not regard it as the very, very special thing that it was. And Jacob did. For all of Jacob's faults, Jacob had plenty of faults. Jacob regarded that status, that birthright, as something very, very special and desirable. And that's really illustrative of, I think, a very good way to look at, and the difference between what most people who do not have a biblical mindset, let's just say have a generic world mindset, the sorts of ethics and morals maybe you might learn in college, even the ones that are not peppered heavily with communism. Let's say just general secular morals. They are different than biblical morals. The two cannot travel entirely hand in hand. Don't bring your presuppositions of morals to the text here, because the text is telling us there's something quite different. And one thing that made Jacob righteous is the fact that he understood how important it was to be the Bakur, B-K-U-R or B-K-R, the firstborn, the eldest male, because that would put him in direct line and succession for this covenant. It would also mean oftentimes that you would be the chief inheritor of your father's possessions. So that's why it's so important. That's likely the reason that Sarah forced out Agar and Ishmael. She made a mistake, and of course she made Agar and Ishmael pay for it. That was Sarah. I'm not going to sing Sarah's praises here, but she understood that. So in Exodus 11:5, the plague of Passover, it says, and I'm going to read it a little bit with like ad hoc OBRY in here, but all Bekur, all these firstborn, in Aretz Mitzrim, in the land of Mitzrim, from Bekur Paroah, from Pharaoh's firstborn son, Bekur a Shaphat, that was, they translate it typically like handmaid, and Bekur BEME. Those are the main operative words here, okay? So in English, it says, and all the firstborn in the land of Mitzrim shall die from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. All the firstborn of beasts. Why? Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Okay, so look, with beasts, yeah, if you have a male beast, especially if it's an animal that you want to breed for food and clothing purposes, one that has a good going commodity value to it, having a good stud is really important. They're very valuable because one male of just, any beast, any animal, one male can inseminate many females. It doesn't work in the reverse. This is the same with men. One male can inseminate many females. That's why having a good stud, say bull or ram or something, when we're talking about animals that you're going to breed, it's very desirable to have a good one with good genes, healthy, and can provide these good offspring, right? Yes, that is very important. But there's nothing in this breeding scheme that requires that good, valuable stud to be the firstborn of that heifer or that female, whatever animal we're talking about. They'll just have more. They'll have more. Some will be female, some will be male. You'll get a good stud in there. Yeah. They'll have more. What would the death of the firstborn male of the beasts matter? What would it matter? The firstborn male of these beasts, they're not getting any kind of inheritance. It doesn't have the same significance when it comes to beasts that it does with, we'll say humans, okay? It doesn't have the same significance, so who cares? Now, I'm not trying to minimize if that is in fact what happened, like literally the first male of every female beast out there, it died too. The problem is, for one thing, many beasts out there have litters, not just single births. Some have single births, but some just birth litters. There's some males, there's some females. Hard to keep track of which came out when, how. Sometimes you can't even tell their gender sometimes when they first come out. So it's really convoluted. Really convoluted. And I personally can't find why it would matter. But he struck the firstborn, the Bakur, which is always used in terms of people. The firstborn male, he struck all the Bakur of the BEME. That's super weird, right? Yeah. It gets better. Exodus 13:2. We're beyond the plagues of Mitzrayim. Israel has left Mitzrayim, and the law is being dispensed. Exodus 13:2. Sanctify all Bakur, the firstborn male. All to me, all the firstborn, whatsoever opens the womb among the children of Israel. Then it goes on to say, in Adam, u BEME. Okay, what's important there? Sanctify all Bakur to me that open the womb in Israel, in Adam, and in BEME. You could say, well, that's because everybody in Israel had beasts. Sure. No problem. Yeah. Of course, we still have the issue of why the firstborn were killed in the Passover, right? And we also have, again, we have the question of why there is importance there. This is repeated again, actually, in Exodus 13:12 and 13:15. You shall set apart unto Yahweh all that opens the matrix, every firstling that comes of, we have BEME, and it's translated beast, which you have, the males shall be Yahweh's. And then we go on to Exodus 13:15. It came to pass when Pharaoh would hardly let us go, that Yahweh slew all the firstborn in the land of Mitzrayim, both the firstborn of Adam and the firstborn of BEME, translated beast. Therefore I sacrifice to Yahweh all that open the matrix. Sacrifice? What, like, I'm talking about killing them? Huh? Being males, but all the firstborn of my children I redeem. That passage is translated so friggin' badly. What we have is, one thing we can understand in these passages is that there is a deeming of importance. This goes back to the idea of Jacob and Esau, what Jacob understood and what he found to be important. What Sarah understood after she made the mistake of saying, well, I don't believe Yahweh that I'm going to have a son, so have sex with my Mitzri handmaid, and that son will be like mine, like I'll adopt that son. That's the Christian idea today, isn't it? The adoption, right? Yahweh said, no adoption. No, he's going to be genetically your seed, the seed of you and Sarah. Specifically genetic seed. There's an importance put on that. And he's saying that he wants the firstborn of all those in Israel sanctified unto him. Now, we can't at this point in time, with a high degree of accuracy, say exactly what he wanted them for. But not for sacrifice, because he says of all of the Adam. We're not sacrificing babies here. In fact, there was great judgment brought upon Israel when they started participating in things like that, literally killing their own children. That sounds familiar. That wasn't what it was. He wanted the firstborn of all Adam and all what? Beasts? He wanted the first male-born dog. He wanted the first male-born cow. He wanted the first male-born parakeet. He wanted the first male-born ferret. Is that what he wanted? Sanctified in Israel? Well, gosh, I don't know, but I suppose we have to move on to some other passages to get the full picture here. Now, the next passage we have to look at, not only in just about every English translation is it translated really poorly, but we have one of those words, at least one that appears that's translated with that inconsistency I talked about earlier in this episode that we need to watch for. Now, Exodus 19:13 says, in King James English and most other English translations, there shall not a hand touch it. He's talking about the mountain that Moses was ascending. He had to make these markers for it, you see. Shall not a hand touch it. Let me just double check here. Yeah, because the verse before, he's setting the bounds. Remember, he told him, you'll set these bounds around it. Because he didn't want anyone to even come near and touch it. Anyone. These bounds were for people to see. They were to be told that these boundaries were so that they would not pass these boundaries and touch this place. Because they weren't allowed. Only certain people were allowed. And so boundaries were set up that people would associate with not being able to go past. Okay? That's our context. And he goes on in 1913, in English, there shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether it be BEME, beast, or man. And now in this case it says Aish, like male. It shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come up to the mount. Well, there's some problems. Besides the problem that, for instance, the word yad is used, which is often translated as hand. I don't think that's often great, because most of the time we need to see yad as actually somebody's will, their influence, their power, do you understand? Instead of just their physical 4 fingers and a thumb hand, okay? So that's not the weirdest thing here, because the reason I bring that up is I've heard some teachers that will use that. They'll take some passages and they'll note that the word yad is in there, and that maybe BEME is in there too, and that a beast can't have a hand. Well, that's a problem, because yad does not necessarily mean the physical hand. It means the will, the strength of someone. You see, it's used, for instance, when David went to reestablish Israel's border at the Parat, translated Euphrates. It said his yad, his hand, because it was specifically referring to his sphere of strength or influence. Okay, it's not necessarily the physical hand. The hand is what oftentimes secures that, okay? The other real problem here is, one thing is the way that its syntax appears in English as compared to OBRY. But another thing is the words that are used. Now, the first word here that is used, it's used in doubles. Both of these words are, where they appear in slightly varied forms. And that's one way you know that this language is a language of meaningful glyphs, because these words literally define themselves. So it has to be a language of meaningful glyphs. Otherwise, you can't know what these things mean. Get it? So in the first way, it's weird because, again, we're looking at the word sakul and yisakal. So in the first aspect, it's a concept or a thing, and in the second one, it's a verb. And we would think stoning with stones, well, that's what's translated. But it's not always rendered that. Sometimes it's rendered as gather or through in the first case. And in the second, they mix both the verb and the concept together. That's a problem, but here's the bigger problem, is just after that, it uses the word yira and yira in the same kind of manner. The problem with this is that it's translated as shot. You'll stone them, that's the sakul, or you'll shoot them. That's the yira. The real big problem with that is that most of the time when you see yira, which it's actually its closest relationship it has with another frequently used word is yira, which usually means to acknowledge, to show respect for. Okay? The thing is that yira, out of all of the times it appears, it occurs 30 some odd times as teach, so that someone will have an understanding of a concept or what's going on. That's what yira is most used as, and then sometimes they have this shoot. Well, the funny thing about teaching, you can't teach somebody something first off if they're dead. That completely defeats the purpose of teaching somebody something. The other thing is, with teach, you can teach through physical discipline. That makes a lot of sense. You certainly can. And it would make a lot of sense why, in a number of instances, when yira occurs in the text, that it's translated as something like shoot or something that has to do with an act of violence, because violence is very instructive. But not when you're dead. Again, neither is stoning. Doesn't really help to teach anyone but the people watching you get stoned. Then that would probably teach them. However, this seems to have more to do with the instruction of the subject. So that's kind of a problem there, you see. The other problem is the fact that the subjects being talked about, that this, whatever it is that this sakal and this yira are, two things, not just Adam and BEME like a lot of passages. In this one, it's actually the BEME first, mentioned first. You'll sakal and yira them first. And the aish, the males. These are the people who what? To be instructed. Now, one could say, well, if a place is holy, then people should, if Yahweh says to keep the beasts away and people away, that's all you need to be instructed to do, and you need to do it. End of story. And now I don't disagree with that. Sure, fine. The problem I've got is this. We have to go back again to morals, ethics, and accountability. If barriers were set up, if this were like a fence, it was like a fence. First off, you couldn't expect beasts not to touch it unless you set up another barrier before that. Because they're animals. They're going to come right up to the barrier and they're going to touch. The barriers weren't even supposed to be touched. Stay away from them. We're setting markers so that you can see them and stay away from them. Okay? The second thing is, if beasts were still roaming up and touching, and Yahweh did not want, we'll say he didn't want any beast, which is a little strange because we're talking about a mountain, and if it's a mountain, then it's big. Okay? A mountain outside. Every mountain I'm aware of is outside. And if it's outside, then all kinds of animals are probably going to come and go on that mountain. Even if it was a mountain in the middle of the desert, like they try to tell us it was, there's still going to be all kinds of life that's going to come and go on that mountain. What about them? This is all I'm trying to say. If he's saying that all of the animals of the Israelites aren't to come near that mountain, what about all the wild animals? Are they okay? Is it okay for the wild animals to come and go on the mountain? The birds, the reptiles, the scorpions, the lizards, the bees, whatever. Can they come and go and touch the mountain inside of these borders? But just the animals that belong to Israel can't? You see where I'm going with this? We're talking about something that is specifically very ethical kind of question here. This has to do with behaviors and teaching. And yeah, you can teach animals. But the way all of this is leaning, and all of these other questions that we really need to ask, they're not adding up. Maybe they're adding up to you. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy, but they sure don't add up to me. So next we're going to see further strangeness in the sense of context. Concept and context. Context. We're in Exodus 20. For anybody pretty aware with Exodus and Exodus 20, that's the 10 Commandments. And we're right in the midst of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments have really a whole lot to do with the way people are to behave. Okay? We'll start in Exodus 20 and 9, and I'm going to read you the English. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of Yahweh, thy Elohim, or Alaik, your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. And then he goes on to reaffirm that with, for in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore Yahweh blessed the 7th day and hallowed it. I just wanted to read that because it's important. But the thing I want to point out is when he's instructing who's to do work, it has to do with anyone that, of course, you have any influence over. He's speaking to men who are supposed to be the ones in charge and have the power and authority in a godly society. And he says, in the 7th day is Shabbat to Yahweh, Alaik, La Ta'osheh. Ta'osheh is to make or do. And he says, Kol Malakeh. That is those who essentially carry out your will. He says, Kol Malakeh. He's adding that so-called feminine ending is a general malak. See, every time you see angel in the Old Testament, that's malak. Those are beings carrying out his will. Okay, so he says malake, kol malake. Now, and then he says ate u banak, your sons. U batak, your daughters. Obedek, servants, your servant. U amatak, your handmaid. U bemetek, your cattle, your beast. Well, then he goes on to say, and, this is important, and garak asher ba shurik. That is, you can say stranger. It's ger. So anyone who, let's say, it doesn't have to necessarily be a traveler. Somebody who is not necessarily family, could be a migrant of some sort, whoever, that is actually in your gate. So on your property, under your influence, you can't make them work either. So no Shabbos goy. Do you get it? The whole idea of Shabbos goy is totally effing lawless. And yeah, that just heats me up to no end. Because all they do is try to claim to be the people of the book, and at the same time do everything in their power to get around every possible law they can. So yeah, no, you don't get Shabbos goy. You fakes. Everyone that is under your influence within your gate. So I find it strange that every being listed in here is a person. Every being listed here is a person. Except BEME, if that is cattle or beast. You could say, what? It makes sense though, right? I mean, you can't put them on the plow or, You can't stop, though. How do you stop animals from doing things that are work? An animal's going to go out and forage and find food and do other things. Animals don't care if it's the Sabbath. How are you going to impose upon them that they cannot do work? Sure, you may not put the plow on them, so we can't strap them to a cart so that they can take us somewhere if we have to go somewhere. Can we saddle the horse and have them take us somewhere if we have to go somewhere? Is that a no-no? So the thing is, if BEME is beast, then you've got this whole window that you get to open for the rabbis. But if BEME isn't, if BEME is actually just a classification, let's say, of a kind of people, then you can communicate with them. You can tell them that they can't do their common work that day. And then it makes sense that all of the other parties mentioned in this commandment are people. Now, we will have a parallel passage to that we'll see in Deuteronomy 14, and I will have some remarks about that as well. Okay, so rolling right along. I just started the recording again much later in the day. It's many hours later, but I'm going to really try to finish this all in one day. So it might be, I don't know if it's going to be louder now or not. I try to run noise filters from the, traffic, fans, children, things like that. Anyways, so the next instance we're going to see. It's a little bit telling, but not as much as the one after that. It's Exodus 22:18. In Exodus 22:18, it says, "Whoever lies or lieth with a BEME, a beast, shall surely be put to death." Now that in and of itself, not that strange, except. And of course, when we get to the other verses, which are just parallel to this, it'll become a little more clear. Something I want to bring up here. And again, it's going to be clearer because we see this again later on in Leviticus. This is just a little thing. But I do want to point a couple of things out real quick, okay? One thing is some of these passages, we always have to look at these passages and think, what? When we see something like, they seem scatterbrained, okay? They seem scatterbrained. In Exodus 22, we go from 22:10 through 15 talking about laws concerning if you give your neighbor, your associate, your brethren, charge over your things, property, possessions, and something happens to them, damage. Then Exodus 22:16 and 17 goes into a man enticing a betrothed maid and having sex with her. Then she needs to be his wife. If the father refuses, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. Then Exodus 22:18, and it says, and you shall not suffer a witch to live. And then Exodus 22:19, whoever lies with a beast shall surely be put to death. And then Exodus 22:20, he that sacrifice unto any god save Yahweh only, he shall be utterly destroyed. Now, these could be just certain laws as they were recorded by whoever recorded Exodus. And I'm not convinced that it was the same person that recorded these various books. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they all contain parallel accounts. I'm not convinced it was the same recorder, chronologer, historian, whatever you want to say, that recorded all of these. But, it always just does set a red flag up when I see something that is, it seems really out. You'll find those verses a lot where the subject matter doesn't seem to completely harmonize with the others. Now, it might be better, I don't know if it's going to be better, for me to just visit Leviticus 20 and then bring it back around to some of the other verses. But why not? I'll just jump up to Leviticus 20 so I can keep on this and talk to you just a little bit about this whole thing with beasts. So in Leviticus 20 and Leviticus 18, we see this in 18:23. Neither shalt thou lie with any BEME, beast, to defile thyself therewith, neither shall any woman stand before BEME to lie down thereunto. It is confusion. And then we pick up Leviticus 20:15. And if a man lie with a BEME, beast, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall slay the beast. As though the beast did something wrong. If somebody had done that, there was a case I remember hearing about back when I was in county jail many years ago. There was a guy who had come in, and he was in protective custody, obviously. And they called him the Chicken Effer. That was his nickname. The story was that he had been charged years earlier with screwing a chicken. I don't know if that was a rumor or if that was true because I'd never confirmed it. You hear rumors about people doing that. They might. It might happen. But there's something about that. And of course, yes, it has a name. It's called bestiality, right? It's a name we've come up with. It's not a word that you can find an equivalent for, in OBRY in the Bible. In fact, in these verses that I read, the operative verb is shekeb. That's the concept. And it always has to do with lying down or lying with a person. In all other contexts except this one. And this is sort of the idea of building a case for or against a thing. Oftentimes, when we don't have all of the information like we'd like to, like I'd like to absolutely know how OBRY works. I'd like to absolutely know how the glyphs work together, how they are to be pronounced, sounded, everything like that. I really would. I don't, and nobody else I know of does either. So we have to slowly, surely trudge forward, building a case for things. The thing about bestiality is this. I'm sure a number of people have done it. I've heard about these really disgusting things that go on, typically more in third world countries where you can see something like this. I don't know why anybody'd want to. I don't. But here's the thing. Almost no matter what culture you refer to, the idea of somebody having sexual intercourse with an animal, probably more than anything else, I don't know of any culture that allows that as just as an open thing, like, oh, it's okay. He just likes sheep. No. Or, Kimbuku is just into monkeys. I don't know what the problem is. Now, I know that some real degenerate, uber degenerate, freaky, weird creeps are trying to push that a little bit, even in our own culture. I get that. But I don't know, as a general rule, any culture that allows that. In fact, I had an ethics professor once say that that there were two universals as far as ethics that bridged every single culture that there was. They were murder and rape. And to be honest, I completely disagreed with her, because there are many cultures which both murder and rape are, in a sense, allowable to more of a degree than an acceptance of bestiality, sex with animals. So much so, there is so much of a stigma typically as the norm in almost any culture, high culture, low culture. I have a hard time with seeing the need for making this a law and repeating it as many times as it's repeated. Okay? And something to remember, that Yahweh actually says that it's the nations, the Canaanites, that practice this thing, the people that you're going to be replacing. And one of the things I think is really helpful is to think, are we talking about they just practice having sex with sheep? Or are they practicing sex with and reproducing with a kind of being that may be somewhat like us, but is enough not like us to where these laws have to be instituted? That's just something to consider. Okay? So now, the next thing is it's a big one, and it's something that I will have to, in a sense, I'll have to rabbit trail to address it. And it's Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Those two chapters, most people see those two chapters as chapters talking about clean things that you can eat and can't I will tell you this from my perspective. Those 2 chapters contain language in them that are so difficult with the level of knowledge that we have at our disposal today to rightly determine exactly what's being said there. In fact, I challenge and have challenged anyone out there to definitively prove the animals, let's just say, that are mentioned therein. Okay? The verses that are our key pivotal verses that, you may eat these animals with the split hoof and which chew the cud. The wording in there is so difficult because passages in these 2 chapters contain so many self-defining words. So the words that are often translated, for instance, that split the hoof, they are self-defining words. Paris, parase, paris. They are various aspects of the same word that is self-defining. And if you don't know the glyphs and what the glyphs mean and how the glyphs work together to create concepts, you are again just trusting the word of these Masoretes. The same thing with that chew the cud. It is a self-defined word. It's gereh. The ger, the gereh. Now, in other instances, ger is used as a stranger or traveler. Those are the chief concepts that are used. And knowing who has had their hands all over this text, you think that they're going to leave a chapter instructing us on good, clean things to eat for our own good and our own good health intact without any fooling around? And those animals intact without any fooling around. You really think that that's the case, do you? Well, if so, I don't know what to say. Good luck. Keep trucking. I hope it works out. But that is a serious issue with those 2 chapters. And the other is this. Akel. The word akel. That is the operative word used in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, where people think it's talking about things that you can eat. And I have an issue with that, with akel specifically being things you can eat. In fact, a lot of people who want to prove the serpent or dual seed line doctrine will point out that akel could at some point be referring to something that's not eating. Now, they say sex, and I'm not sure if I'm convinced of that really or not, but I will say this. Maybe because what we're going to see with akel is that it is part of a family. It has a root that is part of a root family that we need to consider so we can decide whether it should be translated as to eat or not. I'm going to give you some examples of other words and show you how this works and then bring it back to akel. Now, we have, for instance, the word abad. That's Strong's H6 and H8, and it is typically translated as perish or destroy. Then we have its root, bad, H905, translated typically as apart or separate. Do you see the similarity between those? You have the concept bad, apart or separate, and then you have abad, perish or destroy, the A being augmentative. If you strongly separate something, if you pull it apart, it is akin to or like a synonym parallel with destroying. Now we also have abel, H56 through 61, mourn. And we have bel, H50-34, disgrace, or H1077, know or have. It carries the idea of sort of emptiness, naught, nothingness. Abel, to mourn, to feel empty, nothing. Okay, we also have abak, H79 through 81, dust. And the root bak, H1238, divided, made small. And it's also appears as yibak, to kick up dust, to wrestle. We have adun, H113 and 131, Lord, and then we have Dan, H1777, Judge. I'm not going to explain every single one of these, but I hope you will see the consistent relation between the root that I will state afterwards and the accentuated root, which I will state first. You have Adam, which we went over last time, right? Adam, H119 through 122, man. And we have Dam, H1819, likeness. We have Azur, H247, gird or compass. And we have Zar, H2219, disperse. We have Ahad, H259, one or united. And we have Had, H2297, 99, and 2300, one or sharp, like the tip of a blade, singular. We have Ahaz, 270, taken, and Haz, H2372 and 74, behold, as in to take. We have Akan, H403, surely, and Khan, H3559, establish. And I have many more entries on that list, but I won't go through all of them. I hope you're seeing the similarity here between the root and the accentuated root with that A augmentative at the front. So, just a couple more, really. Just a couple more, okay? Arak, H748 through 50, long-suffering. And Rak, H7390 and 7401, tender or soft. Arar, H779, curse, or rare, H7325, flow or spittle. Now you get to Akal, H398. This is the operative word that's used in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Akal, H398, translated as eat, devour, consume, or meat. H400, translated as meat, food, prey. H402, fuel, devour. But here's the thing. Then you have kol, which is the same glyphs without the A at the front. Kol. H3201, could or able. H3557, contain, sustain, abide. H3605, all, every. All right? So, what I could do is just take this to the kol table I have and see that kol is contained in many words that have to do with, like for instance, Eyakal, H1964, a temple or palace, or Kala, which has the augmentive at the end, Kala. H3607, prison, shut up, stay. Kolaim, mingling seeds. Let's see, Kale, consume. It's sometimes even translated as flesh. Or, I'm sorry, finish, not flesh. Also, 3616, failing. 3617, end. Consume. Entirety. It's always referring to, in all of these ways that it appears as a root in a word, it always seems to have to do with confinement or completion. Now, can it be used in a context where the context, not just the word itself, but the context, is demanding that what is there is eating? I'm sure it could. There are other words, by the way, for eating and consuming. Akal is not the only one. or ma'akal as meat. The point is this: if we stayed consistent, and we're looking at the operative verb in both Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, we would conclude that akal would possibly, more likely, be referring to taking from than necessarily eating. And there is another problem found within both Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. And then, of course, you also have the contradiction if we want to look at Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 as saying exactly what's been translated. We have the contradiction of, for instance, Yahweh telling Noah to eat all kol, there's that word actually again, kol ramash, if those are creeping things or lizards or reptiles. And then I guess he very much changed everything once we get to Leviticus 11. And Deuteronomy 14, strangely enough, Ramash, I'm pretty sure, isn't even mentioned in those chapters. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is, and I'm gonna check my notes. And let's see, 7430 and 7431. I'm just going to find out real quick, because I never wrote in my notes whether or not those words are even contained in those two passages. Yeah, it is. It's at the end of Leviticus 11 where Ramash is at, and that's in the notes that I took on where BEME appears in passages with other terms that do seem to make it appear redundant. And it's not in Deuteronomy 14. It does appear at the end of Leviticus 11, this Ramash, which Noah was told to take and eat. And I'll check the other form of Ramash real quick. This is live on the fly. I'm not stopping it to see if I'm right or wrong. And no, it's not found in Leviticus 11 or Deuteronomy 14. Not Ramash 7431. That's 7430 and 7431. So, continuing. Now, and one thing I did want to really drive home, I mentioned it earlier, is the fact that, for instance, in Leviticus 20:16, it calls for the death, to put to death both the woman who has lied with this BEME and the BEME. Which is kind of strange, because when you think about it on a moral, ethical basis, if a person had sex with an animal, the animal is the victim. Because animals don't do that. Animals don't seek out people to have sex with. They are being victimized if any kind of act like that occurred. The next one that's kind of strange, and again, it's translated rather poorly in my opinion, is Leviticus 24:18. Now it's translated, "And he that killeth a beast," BEME, "shall make it good, beast for beast." Well, that's very deceptive. Here's why. Because what's occurring in this verse is napash. Napash is one of those very overarching generic terms. It literally, as far as I'm concerned, based on the glyphs themselves and the way that they're used, literally means something that breathes or possibly consumes. It is, most often it will appear with he napash, a living, breathing, or possibly living, consuming, swallowing thing, okay? It's a very broad term. If BEME were a broad term, napash would be far broader, okay? Really covers a lot. It's used concerning sea creatures, land creatures. I'm pretty sure it's used for birds and men. very overarching term. Now, what the actual text says, the OBRY says in this Leviticus 24:18, is u meke napash BEME yishalmane napash tehet napash. Very important. Very, very, very important. What they do is they first translate BEME as beast. Then they translate, they're not translating napash. They're refusing to translate napash. Or they're refusing to translate BEME. Okay? Because at the end of this verse, then they translate napash as beast. However, if we understand the way that OBRY tends to work, oftentimes when you have two concepts or potential nouns in a row like that, the one will be possessive of the other. So, the way this could very logically be translated is, if someone should strike the napash that belongs to a BEME, then you shall repay napash in lieu of that napash. And if that's how it should be translated, then you have to wonder, what kind of beast would possess another beast? Are we talking Coco Gorilla and her kitten? It's very strange. And why they chose to make so many odd decisions around this word BEME, just like they've made many odd decisions around that word adame, should give us pause. Now, the next thing that's interesting is actually, I can't even get into it. It would take too long. It's the entire chapter of Leviticus 27, because how it's translated. If you look at the actual wording for a lot of those passages in Leviticus 27, where it appears like Yahweh is actually giving specifics on how you would sacrifice or bring a beast, well, the thing is, what the operative verbs oftentimes throughout Leviticus 27 are offerings. Bringing offerings is karabun, which a lot of people want to call korban. It's karabun. It's with Q, karabun. These are things that are brought as offerings, as free will offerings to Yahweh. And when that is done, it's typically brought to the Levites, the priests, and they deem what is best and how that should be best used, because the Levites and the Kenim, the priests, were relying very much on what the people would bring and give to them. Besides the tithe was just a base. Okay? This is more offerings, because a lot of times offerings would be used to help the other people. It wouldn't just go to, or shouldn't have just gone to, the Levites and the Kenim. It would also be doled out to widows, orphans, people that were in need at a certain time. This is something that they did. When you look at the source text, the way it's worded and the way it's translated are very non-harmonious, especially in Leviticus 27. Because there are a number of verses where it would seem more like what's being said is if this karabun, this free will offering, was not of the BEME, but was being brought by the BEME. So I need to shift this a little bit so I can get through all the material that I have. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to point out some passages to you which suggest that these BEME, it can't be just, or it isn't likely just an overarching term. First off, we need to understand that there are passages that tell us that BEME are not herbivores. Now, if BEME are not herbivores, then there's a bit of a problem in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, according to what people determine those animals are that are being mentioned, and the ones who believe those passages actually say the splitting of the hoof and the chewing of the cud and all that. So, here's the thing. Passages like Deuteronomy 28:26. I'll go to that real quick. Thy carcass, this is a chapter talking about judgments that would come upon Israel should they go their own way. Your carcass shall be meat unto the fowls of the air and unto the BEME of the eretz. All right, well, herbivores don't eat people's carcasses. So that's a problem. And then we have something that would not specifically be an herbivore. I'm not saying this absolutely causes a problem in other passages we've looked at, but we need to understand that. When you look at something like, for instance, in Job, a lot of people think that Bemut in Job is this behemoth. They only translate it as behemoth that one time. It's translated Bemut, same spelling all through the H929 BEME, and it typically just means either, they'll translate it as the plural form of it, or maybe something that is, the UT ending is really interesting because it almost seems more accentuating than pluralizing. But if it is indeed a feminine plural, then that's all we're looking at in Job for behemoth. It's just Bemut. And it says it eats grass like an ox, right? That's what it says there. I don't know that that's the best translation. Just to point out that there are a lot of inconsistencies with this BEME. There are a number of other passages, like Joshua 8:2, 8:27, and 11:14, where they say that when Israel was sacking these cities of the Canaanites, they would take the BEME. Now, if BEME aren't specifically herbivores, because that's the only thing that has great value to us, cattle, flocks, animals like that have value to us, okay? The other animals, they're okay. I mean, yeah, if you want some sheepdogs, that's cool, because that's good. Or if you want like a livestock donkey, fine. Horses, fine. But more specifically, the things that you're going to take in bulk are typically going to be those grazing animals, those ruminant animals, cattle, sheep, herds. That's where value is at. And there is value in these other animals because these other animals can do things. That's true. You probably wouldn't want to take the dogs that somebody else owned. They tend to be very owner specific as far as how well they behave. Donkeys can be the same way. So can horses. And you might have to break and retrain that horse. But livestock animals, not so much. You can just take them, herd them somewhere else, put them in another area, whatever. They aren't as owner specific concerning their behaviors. And the problem is, if these animals aren't specifically herbivores, as we've seen in other passages, then there's kind of this issue with why would they want to take all of these beasts? They would just be a burden. Unless they were specifically these flocks and herds, which that's the animals of value, which we know they wouldn't be because we see too many passages that refer to them carnivorously. So we have this real bind, this real issue that's created unless BEME is not a livestock animal, and it's not necessarily a predatory animal, and it's not necessarily an animal on 4 feet. But it's simply another creature on 2 feet, maybe kind of like us, but not. Maybe kind of like us enough to where laws have to be passed, where there is to be no sexual intercourse with these creatures. I'm just going to call them creatures because, I'll call Adam a creature. Adam is a creature. We're all created creatures, okay? Another one that's going to really get you here is Joshua 21:2. And I'm going to go to it just in the King James so I can read that to you. You can understand why it's a little Weird. So Joshua 21:2, and it says, "And they spake unto them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, saying, Yahweh commanded by the hand of Moses to give us cities to dwell in, with the suburbs thereof for our cattle." In Joshua 22, it actually says the Megarashien are suburbs to La BEME Tenau. Our BEME, the suburbs for our BEME. You could say, well, yeah, that would be them keeping the cattle there. Well, sure. If we want to say, yeah, well, that's the suburbs, then we're for them keeping their cattle there. Okay. That would be just fine, except for the fact that we have all kinds of passages, or at least some very significant passages, where we find these BEME in the city, living in the city. So are we back to their cats and monkeys and parakeets? Or are we seeing a strange inconsistency with keeping these things beasts but finding them in the cities too? I mean, something very strange that you find is in Judges 20:48, which in English it reads, "And the men of Israel turned again upon the children of Benjamin, and smote them with the edge of the sword, as well as the men of every city, as the beast." Matam od BEME. And actually, what it's saying there, Matam, it's saying from the more perfect or refined unto the BEME, which is probably why they changed Matam from being something that's refined. It's how Jacob was described as Tamim. He was quite refined and quite complete. That's why he spent most of his time indoors, and Esau spent most of his time outdoors. Esau was more of an outdoorsman. Jacob was a little more refined and spent a lot of his time indoors. This was, of course, before their falling out and his mother convincing him to pose as Esau to take Esau's blessing. It's Tam. And they use specifically in this context from Tam, the more refined, to the BEME. That's interesting too. It's also worthy of note that in 2 Kings 3:9, where in English it says, "So the king of Israel went, and the king of Judah, and the king of Edom, they fetched a compass of 7 days' journey, and there was no water for the host and for the cattle, BEME, that followed them." All right. What's the problem with this? Well, first off, there's a problem with how it's worded. If you look at the actual wording, it's actually worded in a sense more like the BEME that were attending them. That's a little bit better as far as the translation of that wording. But furthermore, now this is a really interesting situation I've had to look at because of my geographical studies. The king of Israel and the king of Judah and the king of Edom, they're all going to attack Moab. Okay, they've got a confederation. They're going to attack Moab, which is just very funny. If Moab was a nation on the far side of the Dead Sea, like they'd be anything. I mean, you can't sustain huge population, whatever. So it says that 7 days they traveled through the wilderness outside of Edom. You can traverse that whole thing in far less than that time frame, friends. Okay? But I won't get too distracted there. What I want to mention is this. So 7 days without them finding drinkable water in that time. So it says for them or their BEME, and they say cattle that followed them, because of course any great army that mounts up to go to war is going to have their cattle following them. Little weird. If you want food, you can take provisions, you can take dried meats, you can take dried fruits, and you can take non-watered bread, things that are more like cracker breads, things like that. That will sustain you for quite a long time. You don't have to have fresh cattle following you to eat. Okay? Everybody can take provisions good for themselves. So there's that. The other thing is this. If they didn't find the water in all that time, what it's saying is they would have to have been subsisting off the water that they brought with them in their bottles, their containers that they would have, their skins, whatever it was that they were carrying their water in. They would have had to have subsisted off of that because they hadn't found drinkable water in that time. Okay? Well, the problem is, unless they had loaded up these cattle that are following them with bottles and skins of drinkable water, what did they drink in that time? Oh, were they just being followed by camels? Is that what BEME is referring to? Camels are being followed by camels or another beast? Like a camel, because camel's very specific in the fact that they can go very long periods of time without water, but most animals can't. Most animals can't. If they don't have that water, you have to give them water somehow. Now, the other strange thing is that, most animals can actually drink all kinds of surface waters that people can't. They're talking about drinkable water for people is different than drinkable water for beasts. Animals can drink all kinds of surface water that people can't because they have different sorts of enzymes in their system that deal with what's in that surface water that people, creatures on two legs, don't have the same systems. Do you see what the problem is with that passage now, too? Now, what becomes even more bizarre concerning all of this is that when they get near Moab, Yahweh tells them he was going to fill the channels that were around them in the land with fresh water that could be taken and drank. And in 2 Kings 3:17, for thus says Yahweh, you shall not see wind, neither shall you see rain, yet the valley shall be filled with water that you may drink. Both ye and your cattle, that's not BEME, that's Machne. Machne is actually oftentimes translated as cattle, quite successfully and very harmoniously within many of its contexts. And your beasts. BEME. So we see that the BEME before, this is all the same story. The BEME that were following them, attending to them, which it looks far more like attending to them when you look at the wording itself. And now here you have the water that you may drink, both you and your Machne, which they translate as cattle, because they don't know what else to do, and your beasts. Well, what happened to BEME being maybe an overarching term that could be used on anything? It could be used for cows or horses or camels or monkeys or dogs. Now you have the redundancy of Machne and BEME. And we'll see that redundancy in a number of other verses. And to round out the notes I have simply on the issues with BEME, there are passages in Job, for instance, Job 18:3, and others, where Job describes them thinking as the BEME. And people could say, well, that's animals. They're thinking like animals. I have a dog who's a smart dog, and every time I put her out front, she gets herself wrapped around the recycle cans every single time because she's a dog. And even though she's a smart dog, she's a dog, and she gets herself wrapped around that can every stinking time. Is that what he means when he talks about their thinking being low and base? They're having an intellectual conversation, a very deep intellectual conversation. And he talks about their thinking being low. like the BEME. And you guys need to pay attention to the world around us today and see if Job's actually talking about beasts or not. Let's just say, or not. Okay, so the last one in this list of notes, which is kind of interesting. There's a ton of Psalms in which BEME is translated pretty darn dubiously. One that stands out a lot is actually Psalm 147:9. Now in English, it's translated as, He gives to the beast his food, and to the young ravens which cry. But the actual text says, Na'utan lebeme, giving to the BEME, to la hame. Not giving to the BEME breads as in a wide variety of breads, giving to the BEME lahame, labani oreb. Now, what's interesting about that? Well, what's interesting about that is laham is oftentimes translated to battle, to mix it up. I've mentioned this. Laham. Sometimes it's translated as bread, but oftentimes it's actually translated, it's got that root ham, to mix, ham. Okay, ham is mixing or blending, laham. Lahame, to mix with, to make war with, or to mix with, to bani oreb. Oreb is a people. You can track the word oreb, and you can see that, for instance, these Oreb came out of Mitzrayim. Many Oreb came out of Mitzrayim with Israel. That's interesting too. So, there's so many more passages that I can go through. There is Jonah. This one's a big one too, actually. It's Jonah 3:8. In Jonah 3:8, the king of Nineveh commands that the Adam and the BEME wear this shock, be put in this shock, what they say is sackcloth, and he literally says, let them be in this shock and let them cry to Yahweh. What do the animals have? What business do animals have wearing sackcloth or whatever other thing it is that they would be donning to mourn? What business do they have donning beasts? I don't care what kind of beasts we're talking about. I don't care if we're talking about cows or canaries, monkeys, dogs, horses. What business do they have donning the garb or anything else of mourners and crying out to Yahweh as though they had any kind of moral responsibility whatsoever? And at the end of Jonah, when Yahweh is explaining why he spared Nineveh, and Jonah did not want to see Nineveh spared. He did not want to see Asher spared because Asher had been oppressing and warring with Israel for some time by the day of Jonah. And Yahweh explains to him, why should I not care about this city, Nineveh, who has many in it that don't even know their right hand from their left, which we would assume are children, and much BEME, which they want to translate as cattle. Why would there be cattle in the city? You don't keep cattle in the city. There's also Haggai 1:11 that mentions Adam and BEME and all the work of their hands. Now, talking about Yod, Haggai 1:11, and I'm going to double check it now, but that's not a problem whatsoever. Because, just like I explained with the issue in, I'm just checking as I go to save a little time so that I can move through this a little faster. But the thing is, in Haggai 1:11, it doesn't say the Yod. like I explained earlier, can actually just be your influence or your will, yad. In Haggai 1:11, it's kapim. That's specifically the hand. Kapim, the cup, the palm, the hand. Literally the hand or the foot. Hands, not hooves. Hands. Hands. Upon Adam and upon BEME. And upon all yigio, labor, kapim. Hands. Hands. In Zechariah 2:8, Jerusalem would be many villages or separate districts because of the many Adam and BEME in her. What are beasts doing in the city? I know people have their dogs and they have to go out with their pooper scoopers and stuff. Okay, I know. But there's no reason why it would be separated into many districts on account of all of the Adam and BEME. So separate districts just for the BEME, huh? Districts in Jerusalem, the city. The city. You don't keep the beasts in the city. You've got your little dog, I know, and your parakeet and stuff, but you don't keep the beasts in the city, nor does it call for separate districts because of the great abundance of them. And then, of course, we have Zechariah 8:10. There was no hire for Adam or BEME. Now, the problem with BEME being like an overarching term, besides the things that we've already covered, is the fact that we see it so often in so many verses with other things that are supposed to be overarching terms or animals. Okay, we see it in Genesis 1:24, 25, and 26, alongside Ramash, Hitu Aretz, which is supposed to be the overarching term for living things or creatures. We see it all the time translated as creatures, beasts, living things. We see it again, Hitu Aretz in 25 with Ramash the Adame, which I covered last time. Degatayam, Opashemim, Kol Ramash in Genesis 1:26, 2:20. We see it alongside Opashemim, which is supposed to be the birds of the heaven, and Hit Eshadei. This is supposed to be the overarching term, Hit Eshadei, for animals. For animals that occupy the land, Hit Eshadei. But here we see it along next to it in the same verse. Very redundant. We see it again in Genesis 3:14 next to Hit Eshadei. In Genesis 6:7 we see it next to Ramash, Op. 7:14, Tzapur. We see it next to Shiratz, which would be multitudes of animals that teem and swarm, Shiratz. And then starting as early as Genesis 34:33, we see it next to Machne and Kunin. These would be animals that would far more likely be those beasts, those possession beasts, which are of the great value, cattle, flocks, and so forth. We see it next to many animals that are supposed to be these beasts or creatures that carry an overarching sense with them, and that are oftentimes translated as beasts, living beings, this general term. And because of how often we see BEME with these things, we have every right to see that as being redundant and not necessarily redundant. We see it in Exodus 22:10 when it appears alongside Hamur and Shur and She and Kol BEME, which doesn't really make sense if BEME was an overarching term for animals. If Hamur, Shur, and She are in fact words used to describe specific types of animals. We see it alongside Baker and San, which are the words used for flocks and herds in Leviticus 1:2. So there's a real problem then if BEME is supposed to mean flock or herd animals, because we see it right alongside Bakor and Tzan. There is an unnecessary redundancy there. Okay, we see it again in Leviticus 5:2 next to Hiyah, the living things, and Shiratz, teeming things. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Jeremiah 21:6, the inhabitants of the city. BEME should not be typically considered as the inhabitants of the city. Jeremiah 31:27, the seed of Adam and the seed of BEME. And I can go to that real quick, since I'm in that neighborhood. Jeremiah 31:27. What does it say? Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah, pay attention, with the seed of man and with the seed of BEME. So unless you know a number of people out there, or have known a number of people, and now I know like the Skebaites are going to come out of the woodwork and say, see there? It's the chimera. Come on, guys. He said he was going to debase the house of Israel and the house of Judah by sowing into them the seed of man, Adam, and the seed of BEME as a judgment, debasing them. He says the land is desolate without Adam or BEME. That's a lot to consider. And you know, somebody who doesn't want to consider this can sit here the whole time and they can think, well, yeah, but I mean, you could work that in somehow, and you know, maybe it doesn't mean that at all. Yeah, maybe it doesn't. And the thing is, I have so much more on this. I'm already at 2:42, 2 hours, 42 minutes, and I really don't want to run this that much longer. So I have to go over a few things with you. It's just a quick word study to cap this off. And this is not the final form. It's just like the last one with Adame and other things I cover. This isn't a presentation. This is me showing you something. You can come to your own conclusions, okay? But we have another similar word study concerning roots and the use of certain glyphs along with another root. Now, the interesting thing is the B that starts out the word BEME. The B is often found at the beginning of a little bit more complex word. And what's interesting about it is I think that the B oftentimes indicates that this is very much sort of the substance of the root that follows. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that, okay? Because I have a number of examples here. And I'm sorry if I'm going along so speedily, but sometimes I really have to get so much into one episode of the OBRY Hours. So if you have to, listen twice. We have words like, for instance, bar, B-A-R, H874, which is usually translated as things like declare, make plain, sometimes even as well or spring, okay? And then we have R, H215, shine or enlighten, bar, declare, make plain, R, shine or enlighten. Now we have Bosh, 887, a stink or a smell, and we have Ash, 784, a fire. Everybody knows how pungent the smell of smoke or something burning is. We have Babel, H894, because Yahweh Babel, the language, or Balal, the language, the root there, Baal. Baal being H5034, disgrace, naught, confusion, nothingness. We have Badal, H914, to separate, asunder, and we have Dal, H1800, needy, brought low. We have badak, H19 breech, or duck, H18 51 through 54. Small, thin pieces. It's thin, something thin. We have Baal, H926, amazed, and we have El, H1984, praise or boast. There is a definite relationship between these roots by themselves and these roots with the B on the front. There is Bahar, H972 or 977, chosen or elect, and there's Har, H2715, nobles, sons, nobles. There's Bahal, H973, abhorrent, and Hal, H2470 and 90, profane, sick, or common. There's Bathach, H982, secure, or just Thuk, H2902, to daub or seal up. Bakeh, 1058, to weep, or just Ke, H5221 through 23, stricken, smite, as if you were smote inside, Bekeh, you weep or mourn. Below, H1104, swallow or devour, and low, H3886, 3930, and 3216, swallow or devour. Batsar, 1219, defensed or fortified, and Tsar, 6696 and 6862, besieged, enemies. There's Bako, 1234, cleave or divide, and there's Quo, 3363, alienate, divide, separate. Bequer, seek or inquire, and Quer, select or distinguish. Bara, to conceive of, and Ra, to see, acknowledge, or respect, understanding. It's very similar to the Re we covered in being taught when we were looking at the markers around Mount Harab. There's Barad, 1259, hail or rain down, and there's Rad, descend, rain, as in somebody reigning, downward, to rule over. Bara, flee, make haste, that's 1272, and Ra, 7306 and 7, wind or breath. If it was Bara, that would mean they were somebody who was fleeting, quick, not stable. Barak, 1288 and 9, bless or kneel, and Rak, 7390 and 7401, tender, soft, or refined. Do you see the relationships? And then we have BEME, H929, which is translated as beast or cattle. And we have M, or Eme, H1992, translated typically as them or they. H1993, noise, disquiet, roar. And then Emun, H1995, multitudes or noise. So therein we see, I think, a lot of evidence that should at least give us pause to consider whether or not this word BEME, H929, has been appropriately, correctly translated as beast or cattle, or if perhaps BEME is speaking of something different than beast or cattle. Not beast or cattle, but not Adam. Something different. And I'm not going to go a lot further in speculation on what that is, but just leaving it there. Because there is so much more for us to consider. Because we're really just scratching the surface at the problems that we see in the text, which I truly believe were created so that certain concepts and ideas that would be so helpful and instructive to us if we understood these things and saw that they were clearly spelled out and delineated in the Bible, We don't have them now because they have been changed. They've been covered up and they've been changed through the Masoretic texts. So, with that, I'm going to let you guys go and I'll end this up. And I will see you next time, when I would like to just hit on a few other words in that. I am going to have to keep on this for a little while longer so that we can start developing maybe some kind of a picture of what's going on and how we've perhaps been very misled concerning a number of things. All right, so till next time, do as well as you can with all the information that you have. See ya.